On a sweltering Georgia afternoon, Frank Mitchell's weathered hands froze mid-motion as he spotted it again, that mangy German shepherd limping toward his store entrance. This time, something was different about the leaf clutched gently between the dog's teeth. A dark, crimson stain glistened on its edge. "Get on now, Shoo!" Frank bellowed, his voice betraying more tension than intended. The dog the locals had taken to calling him that leaf dog didn't retreat. Instead, those amber eyes locked onto Frank's with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. The animal placed the bloodied oak leaf carefully on the welcome mat, backed away 3 steps, and waited. Martha Sullivan, arranging canned goods nearby, whispered, "That ain't normal, Frank. That dog's trying to tell you something." Frank swept the leaf away with his boot, but not before noticing what looked disturbingly like a tiny paw print in the blood. That night, as thunder rolled across Pinewood, he couldn't shake the image of those desperate eyes. He couldn't possibly know that single leaf would unravel a darkness hidden in their sleepy town and change multiple lives forever. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Mitchell hadn't always been the gruff, solitary figure that Pinewood residents now tiptoed around. At 58, his once imposing frame still carried the discipline of his military days, though years of isolation had begun to stoop his shoulders. The lines etched deeply around his eyes told of horrors witnessed during 3 tours in Afghanistan, particularly that final firefight that left him the sole survivor of his unit. The bell above Mitchell's general store jingled cheerfully, a sound starkly at odds with the man who'd inherited the place from his uncle after returning stateside. Frank had chosen Pinewood, Georgia, deliberately small enough to avoid crowds that triggered his hypervigilance, large enough that folks didn't pry too deeply into a newcomer's business. For 6 years, he'd maintained a careful distance from the community, serving customers with mechanical efficiency but little warmth. Only 2 years ago, his wife Margaret, the one person who'd penetrated his defensive walls, succumbed to cancer, leaving Frank utterly alone with memories that haunted both his sleeping and waking hours. The store became his fortress, his routine a shield against emotion. The German shepherd that locals had started calling Max was an enigma. Despite his emaciated frame, ribs protruding beneath matted fur, the dog carried himself with unmistakable dignity. A jagged scar ran from his right eye to his ear, and his left hind leg dragged slightly when he walked. Most telling were the faded remnants of what looked like military training markings on his collar region, though no actual collar remained. Martha Sullivan had appointed herself Frank's unofficial guardian angel. At 72, the silver-haired widow possessed a wisdom born from her own loss, a husband who never returned from Vietnam. Each morning at precisely 9, she'd arrive at the store, ostensibly for supplies, but really to ensure Frank hadn't completely withdrawn from humanity. "That dog's military, just like you," she'd observed once, earning only a grunt in response. Sheriff Bill Hawkins was perhaps Frank's only friend, if their occasional shared whiskeys on the store's back porch qualified as friendship. Another veteran. Bill had adjusted better to civilian life, though he recognized the shadows that haunted Frank's eyes. Meanwhile, Eleanor Reed from the town council had made it her personal crusade to rid Pinewood of its stray problem. The prominent scar on her forearm from a childhood dog bite fueled her determination, though most suspected her zealousness had more to do with the upcoming county elections than public safety. The first time Max appeared at Mitchell's general store, Frank had barely given the dog a second glance. Strays weren't uncommon in Pinewood, especially during the unforgiving summer months when the humidity hung like a wool blanket across the Georgia countryside. But when the German Shepherd returned the next day, and the day after that, always carrying a different leaf in his mouth, Frank's irritation grew. "That mutt's back again," Frank muttered, watching through the storefront window as Max limped toward the entrance. Today's offering a broad magnolia leaf held delicately between his teeth. "Maybe you got yourself a secret admirer," chuckled Bill Hawkins, who'd stopped by to post a notice about an upcoming town meeting. "Dogs don't usually fixate on someone unless there's a reason." Frank scowled. "Well, his reason can find someone else to bother." He stepped outside, clapping his hands sharply. "Go on now. Get—" The dog flinched, but held his ground, dropping the leaf at Frank's feet and taking a few steps backward, those intelligent amber eyes never leaving Frank's face. "I said scram." Frank's voice cracked like a whip, and this time Max retreated, but not before casting a look that, had Frank been willing to admit it, carried unmistakable disappointment. The pattern continued for nearly 2 weeks. Each morning, Max would appear, leaf in mouth, and each morning, Frank would chase him away. The dog never growled, never showed any aggression, just that same patient, almost resigned determination. It was Martha Sullivan who finally intervened on a particularly sweltering Tuesday. She'd witnessed Frank's daily rejection of the stray and could no longer contain herself. "You know what that dog's doing, don't you?" she asked, arranging cans of creamed corn that didn't need arranging. "Being a nuisance." Frank replied flatly. Martha's weathered hands stilled. "My daddy had a hunting dog when I was little. When he'd bring home a bird, he'd lay it at Daddy's feet like an offering." Her eyes, still sharp despite her years, fixed on Frank. "That dog's trying to trade with you. Frank Mitchell. Only thing he's got to offer is those leaves." Frank's hands paused on the cash register. "That's ridiculous." "Is it? Way I heard it. He's been doing the same at Harley's Diner and the butcher shop, trying to get anyone to feed him." She shook her head. "Poor creature's just trying to survive the only way he knows how." That night, after locking up, Frank found himself grabbing a can of stew from his back inventory. He told himself it was just to stop the dog from coming around, nothing more. He left the open can behind the store, and by morning, it was licked clean. The next day, when Max appeared with his leaf, a small oak one this time, Frank didn't immediately chase him away. Instead, he watched as the dog placed it carefully by the door, then backed away, sitting with military-like precision despite his obvious hunger. "All right then," Frank muttered. Ducking back inside, he returned with a bowl of water and some leftover meatloaf sandwich. He set them down, then stepped back, arms crossed. "This doesn't mean anything," he informed the dog. "Just tired of seeing you limping around looking pathetic." Max approached cautiously, sniffed the offerings, then looked up at Frank with what could only be described as gratitude, before eating with dignified restraint. As the days passed, a tentative routine developed. Max would appear, leaf in mouth, and Frank would exchange it for food, always maintaining his gruff exterior. Just until you find somewhere else to be, he'd mutter, though the warning grew less convincing with each passing day. The town noticed. Some, like Martha and Bill, watched the developing relationship with quiet approval. Others, particularly those allied with Eleanor Reed, viewed it with concern. "It's unhygienic," Eleanor declared during one of her campaign stops at the hardware store. "Strays carry diseases. They're unpredictable. Remember what happened to the Thompson boy last year?" "That dog was rabid," Martha countered, happening to be within earshot. "This one's just hungry and smart enough to figure out a way to get fed." Eleanor's lips thinned. Smart or not, there are ordinances about feeding strays. It only encourages them to stay. And then we have a population problem. Her eyes narrowed. "I'm surprised at Frank Mitchell. I thought he of all people would understand the importance of maintaining order." Word reached Frank about these discussions, but he pretended not to care. Yet something about Max had begun to pierce the armor he'd constructed around himself. Perhaps it was the dog's quiet dignity, or his persistence against all odds. Whatever the reason, Frank found himself watching for Max each morning, worrying when the dog was late. One evening, after closing, Frank found himself sharing a rare personal moment with Bill Hawkins on the store's back porch. "Never figured you for a dog person," Bill commented, sipping his whiskey. "Given your history and all." Frank stiffened. Few people knew about the childhood incident, how a neighbor's Rottweiler had attacked his little sister, leaving scars both physical and psychological. For years afterward, Frank couldn't be near a dog without breaking into cold sweats. "I'm not," Frank replied curtly. "Just seems wrong to let an animal starve." Bill nodded, not pushing further. "You know Eleanor's planning to bring up the stray issue at tomorrow's town meeting, pushing for stricter enforcement, maybe even bringing in county animal control for a sweep." Frank's hand tightened around his glass. "It's a free country." "That it is," Bill agreed. "Meetings at 7 Town Hall might be worth stopping by, hearing what folks have to say." Frank hadn't attended a town meeting in years, but the next evening found him slipping into the back row of the small town hall just as Mayor Johnson called the meeting to order. Eleanor Reed was in fine form, presenting statistics about dog bites and public health concerns. "It's not just about safety," she argued, her voice carrying through the packed room. "It's about the image of our town. Do we want visitors seeing mangy strays begging at every storefront? Is that the Pinewood we're proud of?" Several heads nodded in agreement. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I move that we allocate funds to bring in county animal control for a comprehensive sweep," Eleanor continued. "Humane traps throughout town, and any unclaimed animals after 72 hours to be dealt with according to county protocol." Frank knew what that meant. Euthanasia for most, especially older dogs with injuries like Max. "Anyone want to speak against the motion?" Mayor Johnson asked, scanning the room. Frank surprised himself by standing. A hush fell over the crowd as people turned to stare at the reclusive store owner. "Some of these strays," he said, his voice rough from disuse in public speaking. "They're not just pests. That German shepherd some of you've seen around my store, he's got military markings. Could be someone's service dog that got lost." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Seems to me we ought to at least check for microchips. Try to find owners before we start dealing with them." Eleanor's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched. "While I appreciate Mr. Mitchell's sudden interest in civic matters, Emotion shouldn't override public safety. If these animals had owners who cared, they wouldn't be roaming our streets. The debate continued, but Frank had said his piece. He slipped out before the vote, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to remain silent. As he walked back to his store under the star-filled Georgia sky, he found himself looking for a certain German shepherd, wondering when exactly he'd started to care. The storm hit Pinewood with a vengeance that summer. For 3 days, rain lashed against windows and lightning split the sky with jagged brilliance. Thunder rolled across the countryside like artillery fire, triggering memories Frank had spent years trying to bury. He found himself startling at each boom, his hands occasionally trembling as he restocked shelves or counted inventory. "Gonna be a rough one," Martha Sullivan predicted on the first morning, arriving at the store with her plastic rain bonnet dripping onto the welcome mat. "Saw it coming in the way the crows were flying yesterday. My joints feel it too. Nature's better than any weatherman." Frank merely grunted in response. But his eyes kept drifting to the empty space by the door, where a certain German shepherd usually left his daily leaf. The storm had been raging since the previous evening, and there was no sign of Max. "Your four-legged friend's probably found himself some shelter," Martha offered, noting Frank's distraction. "Dogs are smarter about weather than most people give 'em credit for." "Not my friend," Frank corrected automatically, though the protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Just a stray that comes around." Martha's knowing smile only irritated him further. "Whatever you say. Frank Mitchell." By the second day of the storm, with Max still absent, Frank found himself standing at the back door of his store during lulls in business, scanning the rain-drenched parking lot. He'd left a bowl of kibble purchased specifically for the dog, though he'd never admit it under the sheltered portion of his loading dock. It remained untouched. "You worried about that dog?" Bill asked during his routine patrol stop, rain dripping from his sheriff's hat. Frank shrugged. "Just wondering if animal control got him already." Bill shook his head. "Eleanor's motion passed, but the county boys can't come until next week. Too busy with flood evacuations down in Macon." He studied Frank's face. "You know, if you're concerned, we could take a drive around town, see if we spot him." "I've got inventory," Frank replied stiffly. Turning back to his ledger. That night, alone in his small apartment above the store, Frank found himself unusually restless. The storm had intensified, wind howling around the eaves like a living thing. Sleep evaded him as his mind conjured images of Max huddled somewhere, wet and hungry. The dog was injured to begin with. How would he manage in weather like this? "Not my problem," Frank muttered to the empty room, punching his pillow into a more comfortable shape. But even as he said it, he knew something had shifted inside him, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself since Afghanistan, since Margaret's death. By the third day, Frank could no longer deny his concern. Max had become a fixture in his daily routine, and the dog's absence left a void he hadn't anticipated. As he moved through the motions of running his store, he found himself checking the door more frequently, hoping to see that familiar limping figure. "He'll be back once the weather clears," Martha assured him, though her own worried glance toward the door betrayed her uncertainty. The rain finally began to subside as evening approached. Frank stayed open later than usual, telling himself it was to accommodate customers who'd been housebound for days. Not because he was waiting for a certain stray to appear. He was sweeping the floor, preparing to close, when the bell above the door jingled weakly. Frank looked up, expecting a last-minute customer, but instead found Max standing in the doorway. The German Shepherd was soaking wet. Mud caked his paws and belly, and he seemed to be favoring his injured leg more than usual. But what caught Frank's attention wasn't the dog's bedraggled appearance. It was what he held in his mouth. Instead of a leaf, Max carried a torn piece of fabric, dark with rain and something else. "Jesus," Frank whispered, setting aside his broom. Max limped forward cautiously, placing the fabric on the floor between them. It was a torn piece of olive-drab material, and even from several feet away, Frank recognized the partial insignia visible on one corner military issue, possibly from a uniform or equipment bag. Frank's heart rate accelerated as he crouched down, reaching for the fabric. Max watched intently, making no move toward the kibble Frank had set out earlier by the counter. "Where'd you get this, boy?" Frank asked quietly, turning the fabric over in his hands. The material was relatively fresh, not something that had been discarded months or years ago. And the dark stains weren't just mud. Frank had seen enough blood in his lifetime to recognize it when he saw it. Max whined softly, moving toward the door, then looking back at Frank expectantly. "You want me to follow you now?" Frank glanced outside, where twilight was rapidly giving way to full darkness. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the clouds still obscured any moonlight that might have helped illuminate the way. "Can't it wait till morning?" The dog whined again, more urgently, circling back to tug gently at Frank's pant leg with his teeth. All right," Frank muttered, his mind racing. "Let me get some things." He moved quickly behind the counter, grabbing his flashlight and the old army jacket he kept for cooler days. He hesitated, then reached under the counter for the lockbox where he kept his Glock 19. He hadn't carried it regularly since returning to civilian life, but something about the blood-stained fabric and Max's urgency set off warning bells honed by years in combat zones. As he was securing the weapon in his waistband, the bell above the door jingled again. Martha Sullivan stood there, a plastic bag of groceries in her arms and surprise on her face. "Frank Mitchell, what in heaven's name are you doing with that gun?" Frank briefly considered lying, then decided against it. Martha had been nothing but straight with him since the day they met. "Max came back," he explained, nodding toward the German Shepherd. "He brought something part of a military uniform with blood on it. Now he wants me to follow him somewhere." Martha set her groceries on the counter, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "In the dark, after a storm, that don't sound like the best idea, Frank." "I know," he admitted, "but you didn't see him. Martha, something's wrong. Someone could be hurt." Martha studied him for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Well then, we'd better not waste time." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small but powerful flashlight. "Harold always said 2 lights are better than 1, especially when you don't know what you're heading into." "We," Frank echoed. "Martha, I can't ask you to—" "You ain't asking, I'm telling," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Besides, I've got better eyes for tracking than you do. Spent half my life following Harold through the woods while he hunted." She smiled slightly. "And before you go all chivalrous on me, remember I survived 40 years of marriage to a Marine. I can handle myself." Frank recognized the determination in her eyes, the same look Margaret had worn whenever she'd made up her mind about something. It was a battle he knew he wouldn't win. "Fine," he conceded, "but you stay behind me. And if I say run, you run. No questions." "Deal," Martha agreed, already buttoning up her raincoat. "Now let's see what's got this dog so worked up." Max had been watching their exchange with surprising patience, but as soon as they moved toward the door, he perked up, his entire body communicating urgency despite his obvious exhaustion. The drizzle had stopped completely by the time they stepped outside, though the ground was saturated, mud sucking at their boots as Frank locked the store behind them. The air hung heavy with moisture, carrying the rich scent of wet earth and vegetation. "Lead the way, boy," Frank said softly. Max didn't need to be told twice. He set off immediately, limping but determined, pausing occasionally to ensure his human companions were following. He led them past the town limits, where the streetlights ended and the darkness deepened considerably. "We're heading toward the old Millerson property," Martha observed as they followed a muddy path that branched off from the main road. "Been abandoned since old Tom passed on 5 years back. County's been arguing over who actually owns it now." Frank nodded, his senses heightened as they moved deeper into the unfamiliar territory. The property lay on the edge of a densely wooded area that stretched for miles, largely unexplored except by local hunters. The footing became treacherous as they entered the tree line, fallen branches and slick leaves creating potential hazards with every step. "You doing okay?" Frank asked, offering Martha his arm as they navigated a particularly steep section. "I may be old, but I ain't helpless," she replied, though she accepted his assistance nonetheless. "Used to run these woods when I was a girl. Course, that was before my knees started telling me the weather forecast." They walked in silence for nearly half an hour, the beams of their flashlights creating ghostly tunnels through the mist that had begun to rise from the rain-soaked ground. Max maintained a steady pace ahead of them, occasionally disappearing from view before reappearing, always ensuring they were following. "Dog sure knows where he's going," Martha remarked, her breathing slightly labored but her determination undiminished. Frank nodded, increasingly certain they were heading toward something significant. Military dogs were trained for specific purposes: search and rescue, detection, protection. Max's behavior suggested training, purpose. Suddenly, Max stopped, his body tensing. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the first aggressive sound Frank had heard from him. Frank raised his hand, signaling Martha to stop. "What is it?" "Boy," he whispered, straining his eyes to see beyond the reach of their flashlights. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his attention fixed on something ahead. After a moment, he turned to look at Frank, then continued forward more cautiously, his body language communicating the need for stealth. As they crested a small rise, Frank caught sight of their destination. Below them, partially obscured by trees and undergrowth, stood the dilapidated remains of what had once been a hunting cabin. A faint light flickered behind boarded windows, not electric, but the uneven glow of lanterns or candles. "Someone's down there," Frank whispered, instinctively moving to shield Martha. "Squatters, maybe," she suggested. "Or kids looking for a place to party." But Frank's instincts, honed by years in combat zones, told him otherwise. The isolated location, the military fabric Max had brought. The dog's obvious concern, this wasn't teenagers seeking privacy or homeless people sheltering from the storm. "I think we should call Bill," he said quietly, reaching for his phone, only to find no signal. "Damn," Max whined softly, clearly agitated by the delay. He tugged at Frank's pant leg again, pulling him toward a barely visible path that circled around the back of the cabin. "He wants us to go that way," Frank observed. Martha nodded. "Could be a reason he doesn't want us approaching from the front." Frank weighed their options. They could return to town for help, but that would take time. Time that might be critical if someone was injured. Or they could continue following Max, trusting the dog's apparent training and instincts. "We'll check it out," he decided finally. "But at the first sign of serious trouble, we're retreating and getting Bill." "Agreed," Martha whispered. "Lead on, soldier." The forest path grew narrower as they followed Max around the perimeter of the clearing where the cabin stood. Frank moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent years traversing hostile territory, placing each foot deliberately to avoid creating noise. Martha followed his lead with surprising stealth for a woman in her 70s, her breath coming in controlled, measured exhalations. The smell hit them first, a pungent mixture of animal waste, unwashed bodies, and something chemical that Frank couldn't immediately identify. Max's hackles rose as they approached what appeared to be a dilapidated shed about 50 yards behind the main cabin. Unlike the cabin, no light emanated from this structure, but Frank could hear faint whimpering sounds coming from within. "Animals," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sounds like dogs." Max confirmed her assessment, his tail now rigid with tension as he led them to a partially collapsed section of the shed's rear wall. He squeezed through the opening without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness. Frank played his flashlight beam through the gap, revealing a dirt floor littered with straw and what looked like old feed sacks. "Wait here," he instructed Martha, preparing to follow Max. "Like hell I will," she replied, her usual folksy manner giving way to steely determination. "You might need an extra pair of hands in there." Before Frank could protest further, the sound of approaching voices froze them both in place. Two men were walking from the main cabin toward the shed, a lantern swinging between them, casting grotesque shadows across the muddy ground. "Told you we should have moved them before the storm," one was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the damp night air. "Buyer's getting antsy." "Relax," the second man replied. "We'll make the delivery tomorrow. Weather report says clear skies, and the access road should be dried out enough by noon." Frank pulled Martha deeper into the shadows, his hand instinctively moving to the Glock at his waistband. The men were drawing closer, their conversation shifting to complaints about the conditions and someone named Carver who was supposed to have secured a better location. "Get inside," Frank whispered to Martha, gesturing toward the gap in the wall. "Now." For once. She didn't argue, squeezing through the opening with surprising agility. Frank followed immediately after, finding himself in near total darkness. The smell was overwhelming here, ammonia from urine, the musty odor of wet fur, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of blood. "Frank!" Martha's voice trembled slightly as she pointed her flashlight toward the far corner of the shed. In the narrow beam, Frank saw Max standing protectively over what appeared to be a makeshift nest of old blankets and straw. Within this nest, barely visible in the dim light, were puppies, at least 6 of them, their tiny bodies huddled together for warmth. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, their eyes only recently opened. "Lord have mercy," Martha breathed, moving closer despite the filth covering the floor. Max whined softly, nudging one of the smaller puppies that had strayed from the group. The puppy's coat bore markings similar to Max's, the distinctive pattern of a German shepherd, though with what looked like Malinois coloring as well. "Military breeding," Frank murmured, recognition dawning. "These aren't just any puppies." Martha looked at him questioningly. "Dog breeding program," he explained in hushed tones. "The military develops specific bloodlines for service dogs' enhanced scenting abilities, stress tolerance, intelligence. A well-trained military dog can be worth tens of thousands." As his flashlight swept the shed, Frank's suspicions were confirmed. Along one wall stood several empty kennels with military-grade locks. Equipment for training and handling working dogs hung from rusting hooks, specialized leashes, bite sleeves, scent training kits. "Someone's stealing military dogs," he concluded grimly, "breeding them or selling them on the black market." Martha's expression hardened as she examined the puppies more closely. "They're half-starved. Poor things. And where's their mama?" Frank's flashlight beam continued its journey around the shed, finally coming to rest on a dark heap in the furthest corner. His stomach clenched as the light revealed the unmistakable form of an adult female German shepherd. Her coat matted with blood and mud, body unnaturally still. "Oh no," Martha whispered, following his gaze. Max moved to stand beside the fallen dog, his posture communicating a grief so profound that Frank felt his throat tighten. The female dog had clearly been dead for at least a day, possibly killed during the storm or shortly before. That's why he came for help, Frank realized aloud. He couldn't care for the puppies alone after she died. Outside, the voices grew louder as the men approached the shed door. Frank quickly switched off his flashlight, gesturing for Martha to do the same. They retreated to the darkest corner, Frank positioning himself protectively in front of both Martha and the puppies. The door creaked open, light from the lantern spilling across the filthy floor. 2 men entered, one tall and rail-thin with a patchy beard, the other shorter and muscular with a shaved head that gleamed in the lantern light. "Check on the puppies," the muscular man instructed. "Make sure they survived the storm. Then we'll deal with the bitch's body. Still don't know how she got out of her restraints," the bearded man grumbled, moving toward the nest of puppies. "Probably trying to protect her litter during the thunder," his companion replied. "These military breeds are too damn smart for their own good." Max had disappeared into the shadows at the men's approach, a tactical retreat that spoke to his training. Frank held his breath, willing the dog to remain hidden. The bearded man crouched beside the puppies, counting them with a cursory glance. "All 6 still alive, hungry though they're gonna need formula since the mother checked out. Carver's bringing some tomorrow. Just need to keep them alive until then. Buyer's paying extra for the whole litter." Frank's mind raced as he processed their conversation. These men were clearly part of an organized operation, not just opportunistic thieves. The mention of a buyer and delivery suggested connections to larger criminal networks. The muscular man approached the dead female dog, nudging her with his boot. "Shame about this one. Could have gotten at least 2 more litters out of her." "What about the male?" the bearded man asked, looking around nervously. "Still no sign of him." "Probably miles away by now." Military dogs are loyal to their handlers, not to each other. Once he saw she was dead, he likely took off. Little did they know that Max was watching from the darkness, his amber eyes reflecting a fraction of the lantern light visible to Frank, but not to the men whose backs were turned to him. "Let's get this corpse out of here," the muscular man decided. "It's starting to stink, and we don't need disease spreading to the puppies before delivery." They wrapped the dead dog in a tarp and carried her out, their footsteps squelching in the mud as they headed around the side of the shed. The moment they were gone, Martha exhaled shakily. "We need to get those puppies out of here," she whispered. "And we need to call Bill." Frank nodded, his military training kicking in as he assessed their situation. "No cell signal out here." "One of us needs to get back to town. Bring help." "I'll go," Martha offered immediately. Frank shook his head. "Too dangerous. You might get lost, especially in the dark." "Frank Mitchell, I was navigating these woods while you were still in diapers," she retorted. Though without her usual spark, the situation had clearly shaken her. "But you're right. You've got the gun, and you're better equipped to handle those men if they come back." Before they could debate further, Max emerged from the shadows, moving to stand beside the puppies. He looked at Frank with an expression that seemed to communicate both pleading and determination. He's been protecting them, Frank realized. Probably sneaking in to feed them whenever those men weren't around. That's why he was getting so thin he was giving most of his food to the puppies. Martha's eyes filled with tears, just like a daddy would. Frank's mind flashed unexpectedly to Afghanistan, to a night patrol where a military working dog named Rex had alerted them to an IED seconds before they would have triggered it. The dog had saved Frank's entire unit that night, asking nothing in return but a scratch behind the ears and his measured portion of kibble. "We can't leave them here," he decided, the last of his emotional walls crumbling as one of the puppies let out a tiny whimper. "But we can't move them all at once either, not without proper carriers. Those men could return any minute." A plan began to form in his mind, drawing on years of tactical experience. "I'm going to follow those men, see what we're dealing with. How many people are at the cabin? What kind of weapons they might have?" "Reconnaissance," Martha nodded, familiar with the term from her husband's military days. "Exactly. You stay here with Max and the puppies. Keep them quiet. Keep your flashlight off unless absolutely necessary." Frank checked his watch. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. If I'm not, that means something's gone wrong, and you should try to make your way back to town for help." Martha's face was pale but resolute in the dim light filtering through cracks in the shed walls. "Be careful, Frank. I've buried one good man already in my lifetime. Don't much fancy burying another." Frank squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, then turned to Max. "Keep her safe, boy," he murmured, receiving what seemed like a nod of understanding in return. Moving silently, Frank slipped through the gap in the wall and into the damp night air. The men had disappeared around the front of the shed, presumably heading back to the cabin. Frank followed, staying within the tree line for cover. As he approached the cabin, he could see more clearly what kind of operation they were running. What had once been a simple hunting lodge had been converted into a base of operations. A generator hummed behind the structure, powering the lights visible through the windows. A mud-splattered pickup truck and an unmarked van were parked to one side, partially concealed by camouflage netting. Frank crept closer, positioning himself beneath a window where voices carried out into the night. Peering carefully over the sill, he counted 4 men inside the 2 from the shed, plus 2 others. Weapons were visible shotguns leaning in corners and at least 1 handgun holstered at the hip of a heavy-set man who appeared to be in charge. Their conversation confirmed Frank's worst suspicions. This was indeed a sophisticated operation trafficking in stolen military dogs. They spoke of acquisition teams targeting training facilities and military bases, of breeding programs and overseas buyers willing to pay premium prices for dogs with specialized training. "The Russians pay double for dogs with explosive detection training," the heavy-set man was saying, pouring amber liquid from a bottle into mismatched glasses. "And the cartels want the aggressive ones for security." "What about these puppies?" asked the bearded man. "They haven't had any training yet." "Doesn't matter. It's the bloodline they're paying for. These pups come from 2 of the most decorated dogs in the Army's program, perfect genetic stock." Frank had heard enough. He began to retreat, planning his route back to the shed, when his boot connected with an empty can hidden in the tall grass. The resulting clatter seemed deafening in the quiet night. Inside the cabin, conversation ceased immediately. "Check that out," a voice commanded, followed by the sound of a shotgun being racked. Frank moved quickly, ducking behind a stack of firewood as the cabin door swung open. The bearded man emerged, shotgun at the ready, peering into the darkness. "Probably just a raccoon," he called over his shoulder, though he continued to scan the area suspiciously. Frank remained motionless, controlling his breathing as he'd been trained to do in countless combat situations. The man took a few steps in his direction, then stopped, seemingly uncertain. "Hey," called one of his companions from inside. "Phone's ringing. It's Carver." The bearded man hesitated a moment longer, then turned back toward the cabin. "Keep the door locked," he instructed as he went inside. "Storm's got all kinds of critters stirred up." Once the door closed, Frank exhaled slowly, then made his way back toward the shed. His mind was working overtime, processing what he'd learned and formulating a plan. They were dealing with professional criminals, well-armed and organized. Going in directly would be suicide, especially with Martha and the puppies to consider. As he neared the shed, a memory surfaced, one he'd buried deep years ago. His sister Emily, only 7 years old, her face pale against hospital sheets after the dog attack that had nearly killed her, the weeks of surgeries, the nightmares that had plagued her for years afterward. It was that incident that had instilled in Frank a lifelong wariness of dogs, a fear that had hardened into aversion during his adult years. Yet here he was, risking his life for a German shepherd and his puppies. What would Margaret think? She'd spent years trying to help Frank overcome his fear, even suggesting they adopt a dog to help with his PTSD. He'd refused every time, the memory of Emily's suffering too vivid to overcome. Frank paused at the edge of the clearing, the revelation hitting him with unexpected force. Margaret would have been proud. For the first time since her death, he was acting not out of fear or habit, but out of compassion. Whatever happened next, something fundamental had shifted within him. Martha looked up with relief as Frank slipped back into the shed. "Was starting to worry," she whispered. "What did you find?" 4 men, all armed. Frank reported, keeping his voice low. "This is a professional operation, dog theft, breeding, selling to international buyers, military dogs specifically. Martha's expression hardened. Evil business. Trafficking in animals like that. It gets worse, Frank continued. They're planning to move the puppies tomorrow. Someone named Carver is coming with supplies. Then they're making a delivery to a buyer. During his absence, Martha had arranged the puppies more comfortably, using her rain jacket as additional bedding. Max lay beside them, his body providing warmth, occasionally licking the smallest one who seemed weaker than the others. They need proper food and care soon, Martha observed worriedly. Especially that little one there. He's fading. Frank considered their options. The most prudent course would be to retreat, get back to town, and return with Bill and proper reinforcements. But looking at the puppies, particularly the struggling runt, he knew they might not have that much time. We need to get these puppies out tonight, he decided. But we'll have to do it in shifts. No way to carry all 6 at once through that terrain. Martha nodded in agreement. I can take 2 in my handbag if you empty it out. Maybe fashion a sling from my petticoat for 2 more. Frank raised an eyebrow at her practicality. That leaves 2. I can manage those in my jacket pockets if we're careful. What about those men? Martha asked, glancing nervously toward the door. They're settled in for the night, drinking whiskey and waiting for their contact to arrive tomorrow. If we're quiet and stick to the woods, we should be able to make it back without them noticing. As they began preparing for the evacuation, Frank noticed Max watching them intently, as if understanding every word. The dog's intelligence continued to impress him. This was no ordinary stray, but a highly trained military asset who had somehow escaped or been abandoned. You're coming too, right, boy? Frank asked softly, reaching out to touch Max's head for the first time without hesitation. Max leaned into his touch briefly, then returned his attention to the puppies, particularly the runt, who seemed to require extra care. He's saying he won't leave until all the puppies are safe, Martha interpreted, her voice thick with emotion. Just like my Harold would have done. Frank nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Then we'll make sure they all get out, together. As they finalized their evacuation plan, Frank found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. From chasing away a persistent stray to planning a rescue operation for puppies in the middle of the night, all because of a dog who had refused to give up, who had recognized something in Frank that Frank himself had forgotten existed. You know, Martha said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Sometimes the good Lord sends help in the most unexpected packages. Frank, who hadn't set foot in a church since returning from Afghanistan, found himself unable to disagree. Whatever force had sent Max to his door, divine intervention or simple canine instinct, it had set in motion a chain of events that was changing him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Outside, clouds parted momentarily, allowing moonlight to filter through the cracks in the shed walls. In this improved light, Frank could see the distinctive markings on the puppies more clearly, the promise of their heritage visible even at this young age. These dogs were born to serve, to protect, to form unbreakable bonds with their handlers, just like Max had somehow formed with him, despite all his attempts to maintain his emotional distance. Let's get these little ones to safety, Frank said resolutely, gently lifting the first puppy into Martha's improvised carrier. The real journey, both physical and emotional, was just beginning. The moon slipped behind clouds again as Frank secured the last puppy inside his jacket, creating a makeshift pouch with the lining. The tiny creature squirmed against his chest, its heartbeat a rapid flutter against his own steadier rhythm. Martha had already prepared her carriers, 2 puppies nestled in her emptied handbag, and 2 more in a sling fashioned from her slip, which she'd removed without a hint of embarrassment, muttering something about proper concerns versus foolish ones. "Ready," Frank whispered, checking his watch. Just past midnight. They had hours of darkness left for their escape, but also hours of treacherous navigation through unfamiliar woods. Martha nodded, her face set with determination that belied her years. "These little ones can't wait till morning." Max seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining unusually still as they made final preparations. The German shepherd's focus remained on the runt of the litter, which Frank had deliberately taken charge of, tucking the fragile puppy closest to his body heat. "We'll go single file," Frank instructed. "I'll lead, Max between us. You follow. Step where I step. Freeze when I signal." He demonstrated a raised fist, the universal military sign to halt. "Just like those nature shows on the television," Martha whispered with a hint of her usual humor. "Walking through lion country." They slipped through the gap in the wall rather than risking the creaking door. Emerging into the damp darkness of the forest edge, the storm had passed, but had left behind a treacherous landscape of mud, fallen branches, and swollen streams. Frank moved cautiously, each step calculated, his senses hyper-alert as they had been in combat zones. They had barely made it 50 yards when voices carried from the direction of the cabin. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the clearing. "Check the shed again," a voice commanded. "Something doesn't feel right." Frank raised his fist, and Martha froze immediately behind him. Max's ears pricked forward, his body tensing as he assessed the threat. "We need cover," Frank breathed, scanning their surroundings. A fallen oak lay nearby, its massive root ball creating a natural shelter. "There," he indicated with a slight nod. They moved silently toward it, slipping into the muddy hollow beneath the upturned roots, just as the beam of a powerful flashlight swept across their previous position. Frank curled protectively around the puppies in his jacket, feeling their tiny bodies trembling against him. Martha pressed herself against the earthen wall, her breathing controlled and shallow despite the exertion that must have taxed her elderly frame. Max positioned himself at the opening of their shelter, his body low to the ground, ears alert to every sound. The dog's military training was evident in his tactical awareness. He had positioned himself to both guard them and monitor the approaching threat. "Shed's empty," a voice called from behind them. "Dogs are gone." A string of profanity followed, along with the sound of a fist hitting wood. "Check the perimeter. They can't have gotten far." Frank's mind raced through scenarios, each more concerning than the last. If they were discovered, he had the Glock, but could he really engage in a firefight with puppies in his jacket and Martha beside him? And even if he managed to neutralize the immediate threat, there were at least 3 other armed men at the cabin. "What now?" Martha whispered, her voice remarkably steady. Frank weighed their options. Remaining hidden was temporary at best. These men knew the terrain far better than they did, and once they organized a proper search, discovery was inevitable. "We need a diversion," he concluded, his military training asserting itself. something to draw them in another direction while we make for town. As if understanding, Max shifted slightly, looking intently at Frank. The intelligence in those amber eyes was unmistakable in offer. A solution. No. Frank found himself responding to the unspoken suggestion. Absolutely not. Martha followed the exchange with confusion. What is it? He wants to create the diversion, Frank explained, surprised by the tightness in his throat. Lead them away from us. Understanding dawned on Martha's face, followed quickly by concern. But they'll— I know. Frank cut her off, unwilling to verbalize the likely outcome if Max were captured by these men. The decision was taken from them as flashlight beams approached their hiding place. Max made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, and before Frank could stop him, the German shepherd slipped out of their shelter and into the darkness. Seconds later, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cabin, barking loud and aggressive, followed by shouts and the sound of something crashing. That's him! Get the damn dog! Flashlight beams swung wildly, converging on the north side of the clearing opposite from the direction Frank had planned to escape. Max was leading them away deliberately, creating the exact diversion they needed. We have to go, Frank whispered, the words painful in his mouth. Now, while they're distracted— Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded resolutely. That dog's a hero. Frank Mitchell, a genuine hero. They emerged from their hiding place, moving as quickly as the precious cargo and treacherous footing allowed. Frank led them southeast, away from both the cabin and the direction Max had led the pursuers. The sound of shouting and dogs barking faded behind them, though it never quite disappeared from Frank's consciousness. The going was brutal. What had been a challenging hike before the storm was now an obstacle course of mudslides, flooded depressions, and tangled deadfall. The weight of the puppies, insignificant individually, became substantial collectively as the miles wore on. Frank found himself constantly checking on Martha, expecting her to falter. But the elderly woman maintained a steady pace, her face set with determination. My Harold and I used to hike the Appalachian Trail, she explained during one brief rest, noticing his concern. Did 20 miles a day, even in our 60s. This is nothing. Frank nodded, respecting her resilience while also recognizing the brave front. Her breathing was labored, and he'd noticed her wincing when navigating particularly steep sections. The puppies, too, were becoming restless, their initial shock giving way to hunger and discomfort. They had been traveling for nearly an hour when disaster struck. Martha, stepping over a fallen log, lost her footing on the slick wood and went down hard, a cry of pain escaping before she could suppress it. The puppies in her handbag squirmed in distress but thankfully remained contained. Frank was at her side instantly. Where are you hurt? Ankle. She grimaced, attempting to stand only to fall back. Twisted it good. Don't think it's broken, but I won't be winning any foot races. Frank assessed their situation grimly. They'd covered perhaps 2 miles, still 3 or more from town. Martha couldn't walk unaided, and he couldn't carry both her and all 6 puppies. You should go ahead, Martha suggested, reading his thoughts. Get these little ones to safety, then send help back for me. Not happening. Frank replied without hesitation. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." A distant shout carried through the trees, followed by another answering call. Their pursuers had regrouped and were spreading out to search, and they were getting closer. Frank made a swift decision. "We need to find somewhere to hole up until morning. Defending a position is better than being caught in the open." Martha nodded her agreement, accepting his help to stand, with her arm around his shoulders and his supporting her waist. They continued at a much slower pace, Frank scanning the darkness for suitable shelter. They found it in the form of an old hunter's blind, little more than a dilapidated wooden platform elevated about 8 feet above the forest floor. But it offered concealment and a defensible position. Getting Martha up the makeshift ladder was a challenge that left them both breathless. But eventually they were settled on the rough planking, the puppies arranged between them for warmth. "Now what?" Martha asked, massaging her swollen ankle. Frank checked his watch, nearly 2 a.m. "We wait for first light. The puppies need food and proper medical attention, but they're stable for now." As if to contradict him, the runt began making distressed sounds, its tiny body shivering despite being nestled against Frank's chest. The puppy's breathing seemed labored, its efforts to suckle at Frank's finger increasingly weak. "He needs milk," Martha observed worriedly. "They all do, but this one especially." Frank felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. This fragile creature, fighting so hard to survive against impossible odds, had awakened something long dormant within him. He unzipped his jacket further, placing the puppy directly against his skin for maximum warmth. "Hang in there, little soldier," he murmured. "Just a few more hours." They sat in tense silence, listening to the forest sounds and the occasional distant call of their pursuers. The search seemed to be moving away from them. But Frank remained vigilant, the Glock resting ready on his thigh, resting. "Never thought I'd be spending my Thursday night in a tree with a lap full of puppies and a gun-toting grocer," Martha remarked after a while, her attempt at humor belied by the pain evident in her voice. Frank managed a grim smile. "Life takes some unexpected turns." "That it does," she agreed. "You know, Frank Mitchell, I've watched you these past 2 years, shutting yourself away in that store, barely speaking to anyone unless absolutely necessary." She adjusted her position, wincing. "Always wondered what would finally crack that shell of yours. Never would have guessed it'd be a stray dog with a leaf." Frank remained silent, unable to dispute her assessment. The truth was, he barely recognized himself. The man who had chased Max away that first day seemed like a stranger, now a hollow, diminished version of himself that he'd somehow accepted as permanent. "Margaret would be proud," Martha added softly. "She always said there was more to you than you let people see." The mention of his late wife sent a familiar pang through Frank's chest, but it wasn't the crushing weight he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it felt almost like her presence, her approval. A sudden noise below froze them both. Footsteps, moving carefully through the underbrush. Frank raised a finger to his lips, then slowly raised the Glock. Martha gathered the puppies closer, shielding them with her body. The footsteps paused directly beneath their platform. Frank held his breath, finger hovering near the trigger. Then, a soft whine, familiar and impossibly welcome. "Max," Frank whispered incredulously. The German shepherd emerged from the shadows, looking up at their hiding place. Even in the dim moonlight, Frank could see that the dog was exhausted, mud-splattered, and sporting what looked like a fresh cut along his flank. But he was alive, and he had found them. "Good Lord above," Martha breathed. "That dog's smarter than most people I know." Frank holstered his weapon and moved carefully to the edge of the platform. "Come on up, boy," he called softly, patting the wooden planks. Max assessed the makeshift ladder, then began to climb, his movements showing both intelligence and prior training. Within moments, he had joined them on the platform, immediately moving to check on the puppies, sniffing each one carefully. He led them away, then circled back to find us. Frank realized aloud, reaching out to examine the cut on Max's side. It wasn't deep, possibly from a branch rather than a weapon, but it was evidence of the dog's harrowing escape. Martha watched as Max curled protectively around the puppies, his body providing the warmth and comfort they desperately needed. "We misjudged how long that diversion would last," she observed. "Those men could still be searching." As if summoned by her words, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness below them. Frank tensed, pulling Martha and the puppies deeper into the shadows of the blind. Max remained absolutely still, his training evident in his controlled breathing and alert posture. 2 men passed directly beneath them, close enough that Frank could smell cigarette smoke and whiskey. "This is a waste of time," one complained. "They're long gone by now. Probably halfway to town. Boss says to keep looking," the other replied. "Those puppies are worth a fortune, and he wants that male dog's head mounted on his wall after the trouble he's caused." The crude threat caused a surge of protective fury in Frank's chest. His hand moved instinctively to the Glock, but Martha placed a restraining hand on his arm, shaking her head slightly. The odds weren't in their favor, and the puppy's safety had to be the priority. The men continued past their hiding place, their voices gradually fading into the distance. Only then did Frank allow himself to exhale. "Too close?" Martha whispered. Frank nodded grimly. "They're not giving up." He checked his watch again, still hours until dawn. "We need to move as soon as it's light enough to see properly. Get to town. Get help." The runt puppy chose that moment to let out a pitiful whimper, its tiny body shuddering against Frank's chest. Max immediately moved closer, gently licking the puppy's face in what seemed like an attempt to stimulate it. "He's fading," Martha observed worriedly. "Needs proper care. And soon." Frank made a decision. "First light, we move. Whether those men are still out there or not, we can't wait any longer." Martha nodded her agreement, then settled back against the rough wooden wall, the exhaustion of their ordeal finally catching up with her. "Wake me when it's time," she murmured, her eyes already closing. Frank remained vigilant, one hand on his weapon, the other cradling the struggling puppy. Max maintained his own watch, his amber eyes scanning the darkness below, ears constantly adjusting to capture every sound of the forest. In that moment of shared vigil, man and dog found a connection that transcended words, a mutual understanding born of common purpose and shared danger. Frank felt something unlock inside him, a capacity for trust he'd thought long destroyed by war and loss. "We'll get them home safe," he promised softly, including Max in his gaze. "All of them." The German shepherd met his eyes briefly, then returned to his surveillance, the weight of responsibility evident in every line of his battle-scarred body. Dawn was still hours away, but in the darkness of that hunter's blind, something new had begun to take root, a partnership forged in crisis, a redemption neither had sought, but both desperately needed. The first hint of dawn filtered through the trees as Frank gently shook Martha awake. She came to consciousness with the alertness of someone accustomed to emergencies, immediately checking on the puppies nestled against her. "How are they?" she whispered, her voice rough from sleep and the damp night air. "5 are holding on," Frank replied, his expression grave as he nodded toward the runt still cradled against his chest. "This little one's struggling, breathing shallow, hasn't made a sound for the past hour." Martha reached over, her weathered fingers gently stroking the tiny puppy's head. "Poor little fella's fighting with everything he's got." Max, who had maintained his vigilant watch throughout the night, moved closer, sniffing the weakened puppy with obvious concern. The German Shepherd had dozed only in brief intervals, his military training evident in his disciplined alertness despite his own exhaustion and injury. "We need to move," Frank decided, peering through the early morning mist that shrouded the forest floor. "The search seems to have moved off, but they could circle back any time." Getting Martha down the makeshift ladder proved even more challenging than the ascent had been. Her ankle had swollen considerably overnight, the bruising visible even in the dim light. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as Frank helped her navigate the descent, but her face had gone pale with pain by the time her good foot touched the ground. "I'll slow you down," she stated matter-of-factly, testing her weight and immediately wincing. "You should go ahead with the puppies." "Frank, I can manage on my own." Frank shook his head firmly. "Not happening. Martha, we stick together." Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch for Martha and redistributing the puppies so Frank could help support her weight, they set off toward town. Max took point position, moving ahead to scout the path, then circling back with uncanny awareness of their capabilities and limitations. Their progress was painfully slow. What should have been an hour's journey stretched into 2, then 3, as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Martha's determination never wavered, though Frank could see the toll each step took on her. The puppies had grown increasingly restless, their hunger mounting, tiny whimpers occasionally escaping despite Frank and Martha's attempts to keep them warm and comfortable. The sun had fully risen, burning away the morning mist, when they heard the sound of vehicles on the logging road that paralleled their route through the woods. Frank signaled for Martha to stop, helping her settle against a tree trunk while he moved forward to investigate. Max at his side, crouching behind a screen of undergrowth. Frank observed 2 pickup trucks parked at a junction in the logging road. 4 men stood beside them, one gesturing emphatically while consulting what appeared to be a map. Even from this distance, Frank recognized the muscular build and shaved head of one of the men from the cabin. "They've set up a perimeter," he murmured to Max, who remained absolutely still beside him, ears forward and alert. "Trying to cut us off before we reach town." Frank retreated to where Martha waited, quickly explaining the situation. "They're blocking the direct route. We'll need to circle around. Take the old creek path." Martha's face fell. "That adds miles to the journey." "Frank, these puppies don't have miles left in them." She glanced down at the increasingly lethargic bundles. "And I'm not sure I do either." Frank assessed their options grimly. The creek path would indeed add significant distance to their journey distance. The weakening puppies and injured Martha might not be able to endure. The alternative was attempting to slip past the roadblock, risking direct confrontation with armed men who had already demonstrated their ruthlessness. "There's a third option," Martha suggested quietly. "You could go for help, leave us hidden, make your way to town, and bring back Bill with reinforcements." The logic was sound, but something in Frank rebelled at the thought of leaving Martha and the puppies vulnerable, even temporarily. He'd made that mistake in Afghanistan, splitting his unit when they'd come under fire, and had lost half his men as a result. "No," he stated firmly. "We're not separating." Martha studied his face, seeming to understand the ghosts behind his decision. "Then we need a diversion, something to draw them away from the road long enough for us to cross." Max, who had been watching their exchange with eerie comprehension, suddenly stood, his posture alert. A moment later, Frank heard it too, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle, different from the trucks at the junction, heavier, with the distinctive rumble of a diesel engine. "Someone's coming," he whispered, motioning for Martha to remain still, moving carefully back to his observation position. Frank watched as a third vehicle, a large SUV with tinted windows, approached the junction where the other men waited. It came to a stop, and a tall man in an expensive-looking jacket emerged from the passenger side. Even from a distance, his authoritative bearing was evident as the others straightened their postures and reported to him. "Must be the boss," Frank muttered. "The one they called Carver." Max growled softly beside him, the fur along his spine rising. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Max recognized this man, and the recognition triggered a defensive response. The newcomer spoke briefly with his men, gesturing toward the forest, toward the approximate location where Frank, Martha, and the puppies had spent the night. The message was clear: the search was intensifying, not abating. As Frank watched, trying to formulate a new plan, fate intervened in the form of the sheriff's department cruiser that came around the bend in the logging road. It slowed as it approached the gathered vehicles, and Frank's heart leapt as he recognized Bill Hawkins behind the wheel. The sheriff pulled to a stop, rolling down his window to address the group. From his position, Frank couldn't hear the exchange, but the body language told the story. Bill was asking routine questions, and the men were providing plausible answers. Nothing about the gathering would appear immediately suspicious to someone unaware of the operation hidden deep in the woods. "We need to signal him somehow," Frank whispered, mind racing through possibilities. Direct intervention would expose their position to the criminals as well as to Bill, potentially triggering a violent confrontation they weren't equipped to handle. Max shifted beside him, eyes fixed on the sheriff's cruiser, muscles tensed as if preparing to move. Before Frank could stop him, the German shepherd had slipped away, moving silently through the underbrush in a wide arc that would bring him out onto the road behind Bill's position. "No," Frank breathed, but it was too late. Max emerged from the forest precisely where he'd intended, directly in the sheriff's line of sight, but momentarily hidden from the gathered men by the angle of the vehicles. The dog barked, once sharp and deliberate, catching Bill's attention immediately. The sheriff's head turned, his expression shifting from routine professional detachment to sudden alert interest as he recognized the distinctive German shepherd that had been visiting Frank's store. What happened next unfolded with devastating speed. One of the men, noticing Bill's distraction, followed his gaze to spot Max. Without hesitation, he raised a shotgun from the bed of the pickup. "Max, run!" Frank shouted, abandoning stealth as he burst from cover. The warning came too late. The shotgun blast echoed through the forest, causing birds to scatter from treetops. Max jerked violently, then collapsed onto the dusty road, a spreading crimson stain visible even from Frank's position. No. The anguished cry tore from Frank's throat as he sprinted toward the fallen dog, all tactical considerations forgotten in the face of overwhelming grief and rage. Bill reacted with professional speed, drawing his service weapon and shouting commands at the armed men. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. The criminal called Carver barked an order, and his men scattered, two jumping into one of the pickup trucks while he and another retreated to the SUV. Frank reached Max just as the vehicles peeled away, tires spitting gravel. The German Shepherd lay motionless on the road, blood pooling beneath his powerful frame. Frank fell to his knees beside him, hands hovering helplessly over the dog's body, afraid to cause further pain, yet desperate to help. "Max," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, boy." Sheriff Hawkins approached cautiously, weapons still drawn but aimed at the ground. "Frank, what in God's name is going on here?" Frank couldn't answer, couldn't tear his eyes away from Max's still form. The dog's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements, blood bubbling from a wound in his side with each labored breath. His amber eyes, once so alert and intelligent, were now half-closed, unfocused. "He's been shot," Frank managed finally, his hands now pressed against the wound in a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding. "Need to get him to a vet, now." Bill holstered his weapon, quickly assessing the situation. "My cruiser's right here. We can—" "Martha's back in the woods," Frank interrupted. "Injured ankle. And we have puppies, 6 of them. They need help too." Bill's expression reflected his confusion, but to his credit, he didn't waste time on questions. "Show me." Frank couldn't bear to leave Max, even briefly. "About 50 yards that way." He nodded toward the trees. "Follow the path we made." As Bill jogged toward the tree line, Frank returned his attention to Max, who had begun to shiver, shock setting in as his body temperature dropped. Frank shrugged out of his jacket, draping it gently over the dog's body, mindful of the wound. "You're going to be okay," he murmured, knowing the words were more for his own benefit than the dog's. "You hear me, Max? You're going to make it." The German Shepherd's eyes flickered briefly toward Frank's face, a faint recognition stirring in their depths. His tail, that tail that had wagged so hopefully each time he'd brought a leaf to the store, twitched once, weakly, against the blood-stained gravel. Frank felt something break open inside him, a dam of emotion he'd constructed years ago finally giving way. Tears which hadn't come even at Margaret's funeral, even after the firefight that claimed his unit now streamed freely down his weathered cheeks. "Don't you dare die on me," he commanded, his voice thick. "Not after everything. Not when we're so close." Bill returned with Martha, supporting her as she hobbled forward, the makeshift sling of puppies clutched protectively against her chest. Her face crumpled when she saw Max. "Oh, Frank," she whispered. "Is he—" "He's alive," Frank replied, not taking his eyes off the dog. "But barely." Bill took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. "We need to get all of you to town. The dog needs emergency care, and by the looks of it, so do those puppies." Together, they managed to lift Max's limp form into the back of the cruiser, Frank climbing in to cradle the dog's head in his lap. Martha settled in the front passenger seat, the puppies arranged carefully on a blanket Bill kept in his trunk. The runt puppy, now alarmingly still. Frank placed directly against Max's side a last, desperate attempt to transfer life-giving warmth. As Bill radioed ahead for veterinary assistance and backup to pursue the fleeing suspects, Frank bent close to Max's ear. "You saved us all," he whispered. "Now, let us save you." The German Shepherd's only response was a shuddering breath that seemed to rattle in his chest. His eyes had closed completely now, his powerful body growing heavier and more still with each passing moment. The cruiser's siren wailed as Bill accelerated toward town, but Frank barely registered the sound. His world had narrowed to the fading heartbeat beneath his hand and the desperate prayer the first he'd uttered since Afghanistan repeating in his mind, "Please don't take him too. Not him too." Rain began to fall as they raced toward Pinewood, gentle at first, then building to a steady downpour that washed Max's blood from Frank's hands but could do nothing to cleanse the ache that had lodged in his chest. The same rain that had brought Max to his door with that first bloodied leaf now seemed to be washing him away, drop by merciless drop. The Pinewood Veterinary Clinic wasn't equipped for emergencies of this magnitude, but Dr. Sarah Reynolds rose to the occasion with professional calm that belied the chaos erupting around her. The moment Sheriff Hawkins' cruiser screeched to a halt outside her modest practice, she directed her two assistants with the precision of a battlefield commander. "Trauma kit in exam room 1, she ordered, rushing out to meet them as Frank cradled Max's blood-soaked body in his arms. "IV fluids and plasma expander ready, and call Dr. Patel at County. We're going to need additional support." Frank barely registered the flurry of activity as he carried Max through the doors, the dog's life literally seeping away with each step. All he could focus on was the increasingly shallow rise and fall of the German Shepherd's chest, the cooling dampness of his fur, the utter limpness of the powerful body that had just hours before stood guard through the night. "Put him here, Doctor." Reynolds indicated the examination table, already covered with surgical draping. "Carefully now." Frank couldn't bring himself to let go. "He's dying," he stated, his voice hollow with the realization. "Doctor." Reynolds met his gaze directly, her expression professional but compassionate. "Not if I can help it, but I need to work. Mr. Mitchell, you need to let him go." The words struck Frank with unexpected force. Let him go, echoing the countless losses he'd endured and refused to process. With tremendous effort, he gently laid Max on the table, noticing for the first time the trail of blood he himself had left across the clinic's clean floor. "The puppies," he remembered suddenly, turning toward the door where Bill was helping Martha inside, the bundle of small creatures clutched protectively against her chest. "Jessica will handle triage on them," Dr. Reynolds assured him, already cutting away fur around Max's wound to assess the damage. "Right now, this boy is my priority." Frank was ushered into the waiting room, where he collapsed into a chair, his body suddenly registering the exhaustion of the night's ordeal. Martha sat beside him, her injured ankle propped on a cushion provided by one of the assistants, her face lined with worry as another technician examined the puppies one by one. "The little one's in a bad way," the young woman reported softly, cradling the runt puppy that Frank had carried against his chest through the night. "Severely dehydrated, possible hypoglycemia. We'll need to tube feed him immediately." Frank watched numbly as the puppies were whisked away for treatment, leaving him and Martha in a waiting room that suddenly seemed cavernous and eerily silent, save for the ticking of an old-fashioned wall clock. "He's going to make it," Martha stated firmly, though whether she was referring to Max or the runt puppy remained unclear. Perhaps both. "Tough as they come, that one." Frank couldn't bring himself to respond. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep fatigue and the horrifying clarity of what had transpired. Max had been shot protecting them, protecting him. The dog he'd initially chased away, the stray he'd reluctantly fed, had willingly placed himself in the line of fire to alert the sheriff to their predicament. Sheriff Hawkins returned from making calls, his expression grim but determined. "State police have set up roadblocks on all major highways," he reported. "And I've got deputies combing the forest for that cabin you described. With any luck, we'll catch these bastards before they get too far." Frank nodded mechanically, the details of the criminal pursuit seeming almost irrelevant compared to the life-and-death struggle happening behind the examination room doors. "They're professionals, Bill," he warned, forcing himself to focus. "Military dog theft operation, well-armed and organized?" The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Military dogs? You sure about that?" Frank explained what they'd discovered, the specialized equipment at the cabin, the conversations they'd overheard about international buyers, Max's obvious training, and the distinctive markings on the puppies. Bill whistled low. "That's a federal case right there. I'll need to call in some specialized resources." He studied Frank with newfound respect. "You two walked into something a lot bigger than a stray dog with puppies." "Speaking of which," Martha interjected, wincing as she shifted her injured ankle, "any word on how they're doing?" Before Bill could respond, the examination room door swung open, and Dr. Reynolds emerged, her scrubs stained with blood, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals adopt when delivering difficult news. Frank rose unsteadily to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Max!" "He's alive," she began, and Frank felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "But I won't sugarcoat this. It's touch and go. The shotgun blast caught him in the flank. There's significant tissue damage, blood loss, and I'm concerned about possible organ involvement." "But he has a chance," Frank pressed, needing the clarity of direct odds. Dr. Reynolds sighed. "If he makes it through the next 12 hours, his chances improve dramatically. He's on fluids, antibiotics, and pain management. Dr. Patel from county is on his way with blood for transfusion and advanced surgical equipment." She placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "He's fighting hard, Mr. Mitchell, and he's got excellent underlying health and conditioning for a dog who's apparently been living rough." "What about the puppies?" Martha asked, her voice trembling slightly. At this, Dr. Reynolds' expression softened. "5 of them are responding well to treatment. They're dehydrated and malnourished. But we've started them on specialized formula and they're already perking up." She hesitated. "The smallest one, though, we're doing everything we can, but he was significantly weaker than his littermates to begin with." Frank nodded, absorbing the information with the same detached focus he'd once used to process battlefield reports. "Can I see him, Max? I mean, briefly." Dr. Reynolds agreed. "He's sedated, and we need to prep for additional surgery when Dr. Patel arrives, but a few minutes won't hurt." She led Frank back to a small recovery area where Max lay on a padded table, an IV line running into his front leg, monitoring equipment beeping softly beside him. The German shepherd's powerful body seemed diminished somehow, vulnerable in a way that made Frank's chest constrict painfully. "Hey, boy," he whispered, gently placing his hand on the dog's head, careful to avoid the various tubes and wires. "You hang in there. You hear me? You've got puppies counting on you." Max remained still, his breathing shallow but steady beneath the oxygen mask fitted over his muzzle. There was no response to Frank's voice, no flicker of those intelligent amber eyes, no faint wag of his tail, just the mechanical rise and fall of his chest and the steady, if somewhat rapid, beep of the heart monitor. "We need to run some tests," Dr. Reynolds said softly after allowing Frank a few moments. "And you should get cleaned up and have those cuts looked at." Only then did Frank become aware of his own conditioned clothes caked with mud and blood, hands raw from the night's journey, various scratches and bruises making themselves known now that the immediacy of danger had passed. "I'm fine," he insisted automatically. Dr. Reynolds fixed him with a professional stare. "You're no good to him, exhausted and possibly developing infections of your own. The best thing you can do for Max right now is take care of yourself so you're here when he wakes up." The logic was irrefutable, though Frank's instinct was to resist leaving Max's side. With a final gentle touch to the dog's head, he allowed himself to be led back to the waiting area. Bill had stepped out to coordinate with arriving state police. But Martha remained, her face brightening slightly as Frank returned. "How is he?" "Holding on," Frank replied, collapsing into the chair beside her. "Doctor seems cautiously optimistic." Martha patted his hand. "That dog's got something to live for now. Makes all the difference in the world." Before Frank could respond, the clinic's front door burst open, admitting a tall man in a military uniform accompanied by two plainclothes individuals who screamed "Federal agents" with their bearing alone. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," the uniformed man announced, his gaze sweeping the waiting room before settling on Frank. "And I need information about a German shepherd recovered from the area." Sheriff Hawkins re-entered just behind them, looking somewhat apologetic. "Frank, this is Captain Daniel Westbrook, U.S. Army Veterinary Corps. He's here about Max." Captain Westbrook stepped forward, his expression intense. "Sir, I understand you've recovered a German shepherd with military markings, possibly accompanied by puppies." Frank nodded warily. "What's your interest in him?" "That dog," Captain Westbrook stated firmly, "is Sergeant Maxwell, one of the most decorated K-9 operatives in Army history. He disappeared during a training exercise at Fort Benning 4 months ago, along with his handler." His eyes narrowed. "We've been looking for him ever since." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Max, or Sergeant Maxwell, wasn't just any military dog. He was an elite operative with a handler, a soldier who had gone missing. Suddenly, the dog's extraordinary intelligence, his tactical awareness, his desperate attempts to communicate made perfect sense. "His handler?" Frank managed to ask, throat tight with apprehension. "Did you find them?" Captain Westbrook's expression grew grave. "Lieutenant Reeves' body was recovered 2 months ago. Evidence suggested he was killed resisting the theft of his K-9 partner." He glanced toward the examination room. "From what Sheriff Hawkins tells me, It appears Sergeant Maxwell has been continuing his mission despite his handler's loss, protecting those puppies, which I'm told are from our classified breeding program." Martha gasped softly beside Frank, tears welling in her eyes. That poor creature lost his person, and still kept going, still doing his duty. Captain Westbrook nodded solemnly. Military working dogs form bonds with their handlers that transcend normal human-animal relationships. They're partners in every sense of the word. He turned to Frank. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to see him immediately, and I need a full accounting of everything you've observed and learned." "He's in surgery," Frank replied, a new protective instinct flaring. "Fighting for his life after taking a shotgun blast meant for us." Something in the captain's expression softened. Then it seemed Sergeant Maxwell found himself a new handler after all. 1 year later, the first golden leaves of autumn spiraled down from the oak trees lining Pinewood's main street. Frank Mitchell stood on the freshly painted porch of what was now called Mitchell and Mack's General Store, watching as customers came and went through doors that now featured a special pet entrance alongside the traditional human one. The transformation of the store mirrored Frank's own remarkable evolution. Gone was the isolated, emotionally withdrawn veteran who had once chased away a persistent stray. In his place stood a man reconnected to his community, his purpose, and most surprisingly, to his capacity for companionship. "Morning, Frank," called Martha Sullivan as she made her way up the sidewalk, her cane tapping a cheerful rhythm against the concrete. Her ankle had healed well, though damp weather still brought occasional twinges that necessitated the support. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Frank nodded in agreement, holding the door for her as a matter of habit now rather than mere politeness. "Coffee's fresh, and Sarah brought over those cinnamon rolls you like." "Bless that woman," Martha chuckled, making her way to what had become known as her chair near the register. "How's our boy doing today?" As if summoned by the question, Max appeared from the back room, his stride confident despite the slight favoring of his left hind leg, a permanent reminder of the shotgun blast that had nearly claimed his life. The German Shepherd, officially retired from military service and formally adopted by Frank, wore his distinction with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn Frank's attention. "Taking it easy today," Frank replied, watching as Max made his rounds of the store, checking on regular customers with what could only be described as professional courtesy. "Doc says we need to watch that hip when the weather changes." The events of that harrowing night had set in motion changes no one could have predicted. The criminal operation had been dismantled, with federal agents tracing connections to international smuggling rings specializing in military and police canines. Carver, identified as former military contractor Nathan Carver, and his associates faced federal charges that would keep them imprisoned for decades. The publicity surrounding the case had initially made Frank uncomfortable, but he'd endured the attention for Max's sake. The ceremony at Fort Benning, where Sergeant Maxwell had been officially retired with honors and released to Frank's care, had been both painful and healing, a formal acknowledgment of the bond that had formed between man and dog under the most extreme circumstances. The bell above the door jingled as Sheriff Bill Hawkins entered, accompanied by his newest deputy, a K-9 officer named Duke, one of the puppies rescued that night. The German Shepherd had grown into his paws, his resemblance to Max striking even to casual observers. "Just checking in before patrol," Bill announced, accepting the coffee Frank handed him automatically. "Thought Duke might want to visit his old man." Max approached his biological son with dignified restraint, allowing the younger dog to demonstrate his training through a properly controlled greeting. The military bloodlines were evident in Duke's bearing and intelligence, though his personality showed the enthusiastic edge of youth that Max had perhaps once possessed before combat, and loss had tempered him. "How are the others doing?" Martha inquired, referring to the remaining puppies that had been placed with various service organizations throughout the region. "Got an update from the VA hospital yesterday," Frank replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Liberty's their star therapy dog now. Seems she has a special way with the amputee unit." He smiled slightly. "And Ranger's already got 2 rescues to his credit with the mountain search team." The smallest puppy, the runt Frank had carried against his heart through that desperate night, had defied all odds by surviving. Now called Scout, he'd become a permanent resident at the Pinewood Veterinary Clinic, where Dr. Reynolds had discovered his uncanny ability to detect seizures before they occurred. The tiny puppy whose survival had once seemed impossible was now credited with saving multiple lives through early warnings. "And what about Miss Eleanor?" Martha asked, with a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Still planning her campaign for county commissioner?" Frank chuckled. "Apparently her platform's changed somewhat. Now she's advocating for expanded funding for the Animal Control Department, with an emphasis on rehabilitation and training programs for suitable strays." The transformation of Eleanor Reed had been among the more surprising outcomes of the events. Having witnessed firsthand the intelligence and heroism of Max, she'd undergone a genuine change of heart regarding the potential value of animals many considered disposable. Her political ambitions remained intact, but were now channeled in directions that even Martha approved. "People can change," Martha observed, watching as Max settled comfortably at Frank's feet, ever vigilant despite the peaceful surroundings. "Just takes the right motivation sometimes." Frank nodded, absently reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past year. The simple act of touching the dog still occasionally struck him with its significance. He, who had once flinched at the mere sight of a dog, now found his greatest comfort in this partnership. The store had changed too, becoming something of a community hub in ways the old Mitchell's general store had never been. The addition of a small pet section had been practical at first, but had expanded as Frank discovered a talent for matching rescued animals with suitable owners. The bulletin board near the register now featured as many notices about pet adoption events and training classes as it did community announcements. "Almost forgot why I stopped by," Bill said, finishing his coffee. "We're having that dedication ceremony for the K-9 Training Center next week. They're hoping you'll say a few words, being that it was your idea and all." Frank had donated a portion of the reward money from the federal case to establish Pinewood's first K-9 officer training facility, named in honor of Lieutenant Michael Reeves Max's original handler, whose sacrifice had ultimately led to the dismantling of the smuggling operation. "Not much of a public speaker," Frank demurred, though without the reflexive withdrawal such requests would once have triggered. "Just speak from the heart," Martha advised. "Tell them about a leaf and what came after." Frank's gaze moved to the small shadow box mounted behind the register containing a pressed oak leaf, the first one Max had brought to his door. Beside it hung a photograph of Max in his formal military regalia, and another of Frank kneeling beside 5 grown puppies and their father, all wearing various service vests representing their new callings. Guess some stories are worth telling, Frank conceded, his hand still resting on Max's head, as if in agreement. Max's tail thumped once against the wooden floor, a simple gesture that contained within it a world of understanding. Outside, another golden leaf drifted down, completing its journey from branch to earth, much like the one that had changed everything when carried in the mouth of a determined German shepherd on a mission to save not just his puppies, but in many ways, Frank himself. "A leaf," Frank murmured, almost to himself. "Who would have thought?" Max looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to say he'd known all along sometimes the smallest offerings carry the greatest potential for change. All that's required is someone willing to recognize their value. In the quiet corners of our lives, redemption often arrives in unexpected packages. Frank Mitchell's journey reminds us that it's never too late to open a door we've kept firmly shut, whether from grief, trauma, or simple habit. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, Frank built walls he thought would protect him, only to discover they had become his prison. It took a determined German shepherd with a leaf to show him that courage isn't about standing alone. It's about letting others in despite the risk of loss. Perhaps you too have experienced that moment when the heart you thought was permanently hardened suddenly cracks open, when a grandchild's hand, an old friend's letter, or yes, even a loyal animal's devotion, reminds you that vulnerability isn't weakness, but strength in its purest form. The autumn of life brings with it a precious wisdom that our scars don't define us unless we let them. That purpose can find us when we least